and I really do enjoy learning about plants because I forget a lot about what is happening underneath the soil, and Chris does a great job of explaining that.
Thank you, Mark. Matt, that was a great introduction to grazing management. And I think one of the most important things that we can convey to people that are just getting started on that grazing journey is that it's okay to make mistakes. And grasslands are fairly resilient, especially if they're well managed. So trying something and making mistakes, not that big of a deal. You just don't do that again as you move on through the system. I'm going to talk about some of the principles of forage plant growth and grazing management. And again, we have to apply these principles to different situations. So we're not saying that you have to do things exactly this way, but these are just some of the underlying principles about forage plant growth and grazing management. And we'll see a lot of charts like this, and it'll tell you when to start grazing and when to stop grazing and how long to rest that pasture. And it all varies with weather, right? One of my goals today is that when we get done with this presentation, that hopefully you'll be able to look at something like orchard grass and say, yeah, that kind of makes sense that we start, in that 8 to 12 inch range, and we stop somewhere around 4 to 5 inches with orchard grass and then rest it for 15 to 30 days, depending on the time of the year. And unfortunately, without an understanding of forage plant growth, most producers just look at this and they don't really understand what these numbers mean. But my goal is when we're done today that you'll have an understanding of what these numbers mean. So a couple topics we're going to cover today. And the first one is plant physiology, and that's just the vital processes taking place within that plant. And we'll talk a little bit about the morphology of the plant. So the physical structure, how does it grow? Does it have a creeping growth habit? Does it grow in a bunch? Does it grow upright? And all that together with physiology kind of impacts how we manage that plant under grazing. So if we have that basic understanding of how forage plants grow, then we have a basic understanding of how to manage that forage plant under grazing. I always like to start out with photosynthesis. Most important biochemical process on Earth. Without photosynthesis, none of this would be sitting here today. And of course, this is the process by which light energy from the sun is converted into chemical energy, and it's done in the plant. This is kind of the overall process, right? It's much more complicated than this, but essentially we take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and we create a sugar through photosynthesis. And then an important byproduct for us is oxygen. And this all happens in a specialized part of the plant cell called the chloroplast. And that whole process is driven with light energy from the sun. In our forage plants, we have two different photosynthetic pathways. We have what we call our C3, or our cool season photosynthetic pathway. We find it in grasses, cool season grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass, brome grass. And it's much better adapted to carrying out photosynthesis at cooler temperatures. It'll have optimum photosynthesis at a leaf temperature of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's why we get the best growth from cool season grasses in the spring and in the fall when the temperatures are more moderate. Our warm season grasses evolved from our cool season grasses to kind of get over this problem with having declined photosynthetic rates during the summer months. And that pathway is a C4 pathway that we find in warm season grasses, much more efficient at carrying out photosynthesis at higher temperatures. So warm season grasses will have optimum photosynthesis at a leaf temperature of around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So right in the middle of the summer, as long as they have water, our warm season grasses are extremely productive. They will produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used in the summer months compared to our cool season grasses. So you can see if I'm in a rain-limited area, and we all are in the summer months, having some warm season grasses in the grazing system to optimize the use of that water is really important. Also important if we're going to irrigate forages. We're in an area of the country that's arid and we're going to irrigate forages. Ideally, we want to irrigate a C4 or a warm season grass because they're going to be much more efficient at converting that water into dry matter. Talk just a little bit about plant morphology, and again, that's just a fancy word for the physical structure of that plant. How does it grow? Our grasses kind of come in two different types. I brought some grasses in my suitcase on the plane yesterday, and I didn't know whether they would make it or not because I had some other stuff in the suitcase too, but this is a tall fescue plant. We've been under drought in western Kentucky for about over 8 weeks now, and I was able to find some plants in some lower lying areas, but this is a tall fescue plant. This has a bunch type growth habit, so generally speaking, when there's a whole bunch of these plants close together, it looks like a solid sod, but as the fescue stand thins out or an orchard grass stand, here's a little orchard grass plant. As these thin out, you'll start to see these clumps in there, and that's a bunch type growth habit. When they're really close together, it looks like a solid sod. But as they thin out and there becomes space between the clumps, we can really see this bunch type growth habit. Generally speaking, when we have a bunch type growth habit, we have more upright growth, and then some space between plants as the plant thins out. And then we have sod formers. I brought a piece of Bermuda grass that we dug up. This is just common Bermuda grass. And this forms a dense carpet or a mat in that pasture. Kentucky bluegrass will have rhizomes and will form a dense mat also. And these tend to be better adapted to close and frequent grazing. We can see there's a lot of leaf area very close to the soil surface. So even if we graze this a little bit closer, we may get parasite problems from close grazing. This plant will be able to tolerate that close and frequent grazing better than a bunch type grass. So just by understanding a little bit about the morphology of the plant, whether it's an upright growth habit or a bunch type growth habit like this, or a sod former like this, we can tell a little bit about how we should be managing that plant under grazing. So this is going to need a higher grazing height. It's going to be less tolerant to close and frequent grazing. This will be much more tolerant to close and frequent grazing because it's got a lower growth habit and a spreading growth habit. And for several other reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, just a couple other structures of grasses and legumes, and I want to talk just a little bit about the root systems. We've got a fibrous root system in our grasses. So something like orchard grass or tall fescue will have a lot of really fine roots close to the soil surface. And this makes these grasses really good at collecting nutrients that we apply to the soil surface because there's a lot of fine fibrous roots close to the soil surface, and at harvesting rainfall that's close to the soil surface form a nice dense sod. Most of the roots in our cool season grasses are going to be in the upper 12 inches of soil, maybe 80% of the root system. So thinking about that as conditions get dry, these will tend to show drought stress faster. Something like alfalfa and other legumes have what we call a taproot. And we broke this one off. It was so dry when we were digging it, but this is an alfalfa plant, and it has one primary root that goes down deeper into the soil. These can go 6 or 8 or 10 or more feet into the soil if there's no impediments in the soil. And that allows them to find water when grass plants can't find it in grazing systems, so that gives increased drought tolerance. Another warm season perennial legume that has a really good drought tolerance, not the most palatable, but would be Sericea lespedeza. Often found on reclaimed mineland sites. Very drought tolerant, very tolerant to lower fertility within the grazing system. Two other structures that I wanted just to point out real quick would be rhizomes and stolons. Rhizomes and stolons are modified stems. We often think of them as a root, but they're actually a modified stem. If we look at this Bermuda grass, I'm going to tear a piece of this Bermuda grass off for you to look at. You'll see this structure right here. This is kind of a creeping structure that allows this plant to spread out. And wherever there's a node, this plant can put a root system down and form a new plant. And this allows Bermuda grass to spread out and form a very dense sod. This structure is called a rhizome. A rhizome is a modified stem that's just below the soil surface. I'm going to pass that around. You all can look at that. The other, here we go. This is white clover. And white clover is a nice example of a modified stem called a stolon. And a stolon is a modified stem that grows right at the soil surface and allows that plant to spread out. So a rhizome is right below, a stolon is right above. And I'm going to pass this around so you guys can take a look at an example of a stolon with white clover. Here's another one. So both those structures allow those plants to move in the pasture. And that's one of the powers of having a stolon or a rhizome in your grazing system, is that when the pasture gets damaged, these can kind of grow into those open spots. That's why white clover can make a really nice mixture with a bunch grass. If you kind of picture a bunch grass growing, and over time they get a little bit thin between there, if we have a white clover in there, it can kind of fill those spaces between those two bunches of grass in instead of a weed growing there, we have something that's desirable within that pasture. Okay. I apologize, this is not a cow, this is my wife's horse. And but horses are good grazers. I mean, they're really efficient at grazing really close to the soil surface. And the question is if we have a grazing event taking place here, if we want this pasture to regrow, what do we have to have for it to regrow? If we have adequate water, and we've got good soil fertility that Matt kind of talked a little bit about already, what does that plant need to regrow with? The what? Roots? Okay, good roots. What else? Leaf. What's the leaf do? It captures the sun. So this plant needs energy to regrow with. And in grass plants, energy comes from two places. It comes from leaf area remaining after grazing, exactly what you said. That's why we don't want to graze a pasture all the way to the ground. If we graze off this top part of the plant and we leave maybe 4 inches of green leaf material, that kind of supplies a solar panel or a photosynthetic panel for this pasture to regrow with. So we're able to capture sunlight, turn it into sugars and carbohydrates, and fuel that regrowth in that pasture. That's one of the basic principles of rotational stocking, is leaving some leaf area in that pasture. And that leaf area acts as a solar panel so that pasture can regrow from sunlight. The second place is store carbohydrates. And plants store carbohydrates in different spots. And those stored carbohydrates is an energy source that plant can mobilize to regrow after grazing. So this is just a table that shows where different plants store their carbohydrates. For example, if we look at orchard grass or tall fescue, they're storing their carbohydrates in the stem base. So this part of the plant right here is kind of where it's storing its carbohydrates at. So what happens when I graze this pasture off, and I graze all the leaf area off, and then I leave them in a little bit too long, and I graze off the stem base, what do I have left there? Not a lot, right? So I've reduced the ability of that plant to capture sunlight, right? Because I've removed all of its leaves. And then I've got into where it stores its carbohydrates for regrowth. If I graze a pasture close one time, it's not going to kill that pasture. It's that repeated grazing over and over again. Every time it regrows a little bit, that animal's right there to take that bite of that green leaf material and that stem base off. That will slow recovery of that pasture, that repeated grazing. So in contrast, if we look at something like Bermuda grass, and I passed that piece around, here's another one. But Bermuda grass is storing its carbohydrates in the stolons and rhizomes of that plant. That's safely below the soil surface. So even though I graze the stand really close, I'm not removing that stored energy from that plant. And that makes Bermuda grass, plus it's got a lot of leaf area, that where it stores its carbohydrates and a lot of leaf area close to the soil surface makes us very tolerant of close and frequent grazing in grazing systems. So the point of this slide is that not that we can't use orchard grass or tall fescue in a grazing system because of where it stores its carbohydrates, we just have to manage that grazing a little bit different. If we know a plant storing its carbohydrates above the soil surface, in the base of the stem, then it's important we don't graze it too close. Something like Bermuda grass or Kentucky bluegrass is storing that carbohydrates in the rhizome system of the plant are much more tolerant to close frequent grazing because those stored carbohydrates are safely located below the grazing height of the animal. I like to use alfalfa as an example of carbohydrate cycling. And when we cut an alfalfa field for hay, what's left in that field after we cut it for hay? What's it look like? Anybody know? Stems. Yeah, basically stems. But it regrows really fast, right? So alfalfa is 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. I can cut an alfalfa plant and put a bucket over it in a field, and it's still going to regrow. It's going to regrow because it's getting its energy from stored carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant. So an alfalfa plant is storing its energy in the taproot of this plant for regrowth, safely below the mowing or the grazing height. So even though we remove all the leaves when we mow it, it still regrows very fast because it's mobilizing stored carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant. That's one of the reasons that alfalfa is such a nice example of a carbohydrate cycle in a plant. So what happens in alfalfa is that we have a defoliation event here. The plant starts to regrow very quickly. The non-structural carbohydrate concentration in the roots decreases very quickly. They're being mobilized for regrowth of that plant. When that plant gets about 6 to 8 inches tall, we start getting enough leaf area regenerated on this plant that it's capturing enough sunlight, and through photosynthesis it generates more sugars and carbohydrates that it needs for growth and maintenance of the plant, and it shifts those extra carbohydrates back into storage in the taproot. And by the time we're ready to cut it again in 28 days, we're back up to pre-cut levels in terms of stored carbohydrates. This is what we call a carbohydrate cycle within the plant. All plants have a carbohydrate cycle. It's most pronounced in alfalfa because it's 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. But grasses have that cycle too. Less pronounced because it's dependent on both remaining leaf area and stored carbohydrates for regrowth. So one of the things that we manage when we talk about improved grazing is just not leaf area, but we're managing this carbohydrate cycle. You can imagine what would happen to an alfalfa plant if it got 6 inches tall and we came back in and we grazed it again. It's going to regrow, but it's going to pull the carbohydrates down even further. And we can do that a couple times, but every time we do that, that regrowth is going to be slower and slower and slower. And that's what happens in a continuously grazed pasture. Plant never gets a chance to recover and store those carbohydrates back up. And the growth becomes slower and slower and slower, and eventually the pasture stand starts to thin. What happens in thin pasture stands? Weeds, that's right. So the good Lord doesn't leave the soil bare long, right? Something's going to grow there. Often it's something we don't really want in that stand. Not all weeds are bad for sure, but we want to have a nice mix of some weedy forbs and then some desirable forage species. Sure.
You described starch as storage versus purchasing. Starch, are we talking amylose, amylopectin?
Yes, so starches would be what the storage compounds would be. If you go back one slide here, this tells you the storage form in the different forage species. Right. I would say the starch would tend to be more concentrated in the storage organ of the plant. So maybe probably more concentrated in the, if we had a cool season grass in the very stem base, we would find more fructosans because that's what the storage compound would be in a grass, or in an alfalfa or a clover, it would be in the taproot of the plant, or in the stolons and rhizomes in Bermuda grass.
More mature plants. More mature plants. Non-fiber, well, yeah, but non-fiber carbohydrates are now lower. Mature plants are usually less than 20%.
It kind of depends on the plant. Sometimes you'll see an increase in starch, like in a small grain, that would accumulate a lot of starch in the seed head of the plant. So I don't know a good answer. You know a better answer, Matt? All right. So this is a diagram. This is from a very old publication by Dr. Blazer. He was at Virginia Tech a long time ago, and kind of a guy ahead of his time in terms of grazing management. This is a tiller of tall fescue. And what Dr. Blazer said in this diagram here is that once we have a collared leaf on this plant, once that collar is present, this leaf's not going to regrow if it's cut. So the question is, if I'm managing grazing, and I know most of the nutrients in a plant are going to be in the leaves, right? Do I leave this leaf, or do I graze it off? Before you answer, just think a little bit about the function of that leaf. So do we leave it or graze it off? What do you think? Don't answer yet. Let me pass out. I brought some tillers. These aren't the perfect tillers because we've been so dry, but I brought a few tillers that I pulled up yesterday. I think the airport security was surprised at what was in my suitcase yesterday. Yeah, I'm on their radar now. I did have a knife in my carry-on also. I'm really not doing well here. Okay, here's a tiller. So the collar is this part right here on the leaf. Let me advance one slide here. I got a bunch, so just hold on to it. That's the collar of the leaf. Here's the collar on that leaf. That's a collar right there. So that's the collar right there. That leaf is not going to regrow anymore. I'm running out of tillers. I'm ask you guys to. Here's one there. Here's the collar right here on the leaf. And Matt knows what a collar is. So the question is do we leave this leaf here, or do we graze it off? It's not going to regrow. Do we leave it or graze it off? Before you answer, tell me what color is that leaf right there that has the color showing? It's not a trick question, I promise. Green. What's green mean? Photosynthesis. So should we leave it or graze it off? Nobody wants to take a step out, right? It depends.
If it's in the growing season for that plant, it's going to regrow.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So not a straight answer, right? But in general, we need to leave some leaf area in that field, because even though that plant, that leaf is not going to regrow once it's colored, it's still green and actively photosynthesizing. And where do you think that energy is going if it's not regrowing? Back down into the plant, so that back down into the plant, and it's fueling the growth of this new leaf that's coming out of the plant. So leaving some leaf area in that pasture is really important, even to maintain that photosynthetic area of that plant. Okay, this is one of my favorite diagrams from Dr. Blazer's publication, and I kind of broke it up into two areas. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but I took this blue line and divided it into half, and these plants on your left would be what I would call a rotationally grazed plant, so they have a high carbohydrate status. CHO stands for carbohydrates. The ones on the right have a low carbohydrate status. So they're kind of what we would call a continuously grazed pasture. So every time that plant regrew a little bit, that animal was right there to nip that forage off, nip that forage off, nip that forage off. And that caused a low carbohydrate status to form in that plant. And then Dr. Blazer did two other things. He either left 2 inches of residual leaf area on this tiller, or he removed all the residual leaf area. And then he looked at regrowth of that plant. 10 minutes? Okay. And what he found was that when he had 2 inches of residual leaf area and a high carbohydrate status going into that grazing event, he got 1 inch of regrowth. When he had no leaf area left and a low carbohydrate status, he got less than half as much regrowth on that plant in the same time period. Plus, he got 4 new tillers formed here and a tiller and a half formed here, so that stand is actively thinning. So if you go home tonight and you look at one figure, look at this one. If you understand this, you really understand the whole basis of rotational stocking. There's those principles of rotational stocking. We're managing that leaf area, that photosynthetic area, and we're managing the carbohydrate status of the plant or the food reserves in that plant when we start to manage pastures. Okay, what's going on underneath the ground? And Matt kind of alluded to this a little bit, and this is something we don't talk enough about to grazers. What we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil surface. There was a study done by Kreider. He worked for the USDA in the 1950s. Old, but old stuff's not bad, and the older I get, I learned that more and more. What he did was when he removed 50% of the shoots, so if I had 10 inches of plant and I removed 5, I temporarily stopped root growth. When I removed 90% of the shoots, he stopped root growth for 17 days. When he clipped that plant 3 times a week, so that would simulate what's in a rotational grazing, a continuous grazing system, every time that plant regrew a little bit, he clipped off that leaf area, root growth never resumed. When he removed 40% or less of the top of the plant, so if I had 10 inches and I removed 4 inches of the top of the plant and left 6 inches, root growth never stopped. And this is really important to understand, because what we do to the top of that plant impacts what's below the soil. What management impact could that have as we move through the grazing season? If we graze really close, infrequently, to that plant? What are we doing to that root system? We're making it smaller. Okay, when we make the root system smaller in the plant, what management implication does that have as we move through the summer months? Makes that plant more susceptible to drought stress. That's one of the big benefits that we don't talk enough about with rotational stocking, is that when we start to manage that plant, we're not only managing the top, but what's below the soil surface, and that has a real impact on productivity of that plant, but also on the drought tolerance of that plant and grazing systems. When we start to look at drought tolerance, one of the most important things we can do to mitigate short-term drought stress in grazing systems, which we will always have, even in the humid eastern United States, is implementing some type of controlled or managed or rotational stocking, whatever you want to call it, Matt, that's helping us keep a healthy root system that's going to be able to find water when things start to get dry. One of the first things that producers notice when they switch from a continuous to rotational stocking system is that their pastures go longer into a drought stress, and they come out of that drought stress faster. And that's a very, very important benefit of rotational stocking. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay. So this is just a really nice diagram that kind of summarizes puts kind of all these concepts together. And if we look at a plant here, for example, if we look at orchard grass, we've got a fairly close grazing height here, below 2 inches. If I defoliate orchard grass to 2 inches, do I have a lot of leaf area left on that plant? Not a lot. Where does orchard grass store its carbohydrates at? In the stem base, right? So I'm starting to get down into the area of the plant that's storing its carbohydrates. So how tolerant of close and frequent grazing is orchard grass going to be? Not real tolerant. It doesn't mean we can't use it, it just means we need to manage it differently. Probably one of the worst things that's ever happened to orchard grass is the invention of the disc mower. When we have orchard grass in a hay production system, disc mowers can cut so close to the soil surface that orchard grass stands have a very difficult time, if that mower is not adjusted correctly, of maintaining themselves in a stand. Now, in contrast, Bermuda grass, on the other hand, stores its sugars, stored carbohydrates in the stolon and rhizome system of the plant. So they're safely below the grazing height of the animal, plus it's got a lot of leaf area close to the soil surface below that close grazing height. So it's going to do much better under that close grazing and more frequent grazing management than something like orchard grass or tall fescue would do. So understanding just a few principles of forage plant growth and grazing management can tell us a lot about how we should be managing those plants under grazing. So just want to mention getting started in rotational stocking. And the first thing I always tell people, it doesn't matter what you call it, right? Rotational grazing or stocking or management-intensive grazing or adaptive grazing management, but getting started, you have to go into it with the right attitude. If you're working with a producer and they're just like, well, this is never going to work, chances of it actually working are pretty slim, right? So you've got to go into it with the right attitude, because you're going to have too much water and not enough water and other issues associated with grazing management. But if you have the right attitude, you kind of find your way around those roadblocks. And that attitude is really important to being successful with rotational grazing. Water's key. I don't know if we're going to talk much about water distribution. Matt will talk maybe a little bit about water distribution, but having good access to water is key to implementing rotational stocking. And again, we're managing two things: how close we graze and how long that plant gets rested. And that's going to improve not only pasture productivity, but also drought stress in that plant and nutrient distribution in terms of dung and urine deposition within that pasture. As we start to implement rotational grazing, and Matt talked about regenerative grazing, and I always like to say that good grazing management is inherently regenerative, right? So don't get so caught up on the terms, but good grazing management is going to result in stronger nutrient cycles, and it's important we decouple ourselves from commodity prices of fertilizer if we can. That doesn't mean we don't need fertilizer, but once we build fertility levels up, and we'll talk more about this afternoon, once we build fertility levels up, very few nutrients are removed from a cow-calf system. The other power of rotational grazing is it allows us to manage botanical composition of pasture. So how we manage that grazing, we can shift. So we talk about pastures like they're monocultures, but that's not what they are. They're really complex mixtures of many different plants, of especially mature pastures. So if I have a mixture of Bermuda grass and tall fescue in a pasture, and I want to shift that botanical composition of the plants in that pasture towards Bermuda grass, then I can manage my grazing differently and shift this composition of this pasture towards the Bermuda grass. Going the other way, if I want to shift it towards a taller growing grass, then I change grazing management and I can shift it towards a taller growing grass in that pasture. Grazing management's a powerful tool for managing botanical composition in pastures. And I think I'll leave it there, Mark, okay?